Harriet's eyes flutter open to the slow beep of a heart monitor and the faint scent of antiseptic. She was admitted to St. Germain's Hospital the night before with a nasty case of pneumonia, and the doctors decided to keep her for observation. The room is dark, the curtains drawn, and Harriet feels the stiffness in her limbs from sleeping in a strange bed. She shifts under the thin hospital blanket, wincing at the dull ache in her lungs. She notices for the first time she's not alone. The bed beside her holds another patient, a silent, frail figure clad in a pale blue hospital gown. Harriet wonders how she slept through someone else's arrival. Hospitals are rarely quiet. Nurses come and go, pushing squeaking carts, giving IVs and medications. Yet somehow this patient managed to slip into the room without Harriet waking. She observes the woman carefully. The pale overhead light reflects on gray, wiry hair matted against her skull, and Harriet guesses the woman must be in her 70s. Though the woman's eyes are closed, her lips move in a slow, continuous whisper. Harriet can't make out the words, but the gentle hiss of breath creeps into her ears. It's almost comforting at first, like a soft lullaby. Harriet rolls onto her side, letting herself drift off again. An hour later, Harriet stirs when a nurse comes in to check her vitals. The nurse, a cheerful woman named Pauline, notices Harriet's eyes flicker toward the other bed. With a sad smile, Pauline says, "Don't mind Mrs. Langford. She doesn't talk much, but, well, she's been here quite a while." Harriet's curiosity piques. "What's wrong with her?" she asks, careful to keep her voice low. Mrs. Langford is still whispering, her eyes half-lidded. Pauline hesitates. "She had a stroke. Sometimes she experiences hallucinations. We do our best to keep her comfortable." After the nurse leaves, Harriet tries to get some rest, but the incessant whispering continues. By evening, Harriet feels her fever returning, and a deep cough racks her body. She presses the call button for assistance. By the time a nurse arrives, Harriet's cheeks are flushed and her eyes are watering. The nurse administers medication to help her rest. Harriet closes her eyes, hoping for relief. She drifts to sleep again with Mrs. Langford's whisper echoing in her ears. In the middle of the night, Harriet wakes abruptly. The entire room is unnaturally quiet. No footsteps in the halls, no rolling carts, no chirping monitors. A thick tension presses against her chest. Mrs. Langford is sitting upright in her bed, head turned towards Harriet, though Harriet can only make out the faint outline of the old woman's silhouette against the darkness. Harriet's heart hammers. She notices that Mrs. Langford is no longer whispering. Instead, she's absolutely silent. Harriet tries to calm herself with slow, measured breaths, but there's a prickling along her spine that refuses to subside. A flicker of movement startles Harriet. She sees Mrs. Langford's bony hand rise, beckoning her with a single, crooked finger. The gesture is deliberate, commanding. Harriet wants to look away, but something compels her to meet the woman's gaze. Even in the darkness, she can sense the intensity behind Mrs. Langford's half-glazed eyes. Then the whispering resumes, more urgent than before. Harriet still can't decipher the words, but the sound slithers through her mind, coiling around her thoughts. Harriet panics and scrambles for the bedside lamp. She fumbles, knocking over a plastic cup of water, but eventually finds the switch. The sudden light illuminates the room. Mrs. Langford is still there, perched on the bed's edge, her mouth working through those frantic whispers. Harriet can see the woman's cheeks, sunken and hollow, and her eyes, wide with an unrecognizable emotion. A nurse rushes in moments later, alarmed by Harriet's cries, but Mrs. Langford collapses back onto the mattress, lips sealed. The nurse examines her but finds no change in vitals. She assures Harriet it must have been a dream, an effect of her fever. The next morning, Harriet feels an urge to talk with Mrs. Langford to break the tension that's built up. She gingerly approaches the bed, ignoring the stiffness in her own body. Mrs. Langford's eyes flutter open, focusing on Harriet. For a moment, her lips stop moving. "Do you need something?" Harriet asks kindly, but the old woman returns to her whisper. Harriet leans closer, straining to hear. She picks out a few distinct words. "Gone. They're all gone." Before Harriet can ask more, a strong smell of bleach and cleaning agents wafts into the room. An orderly arrives, politely telling Harriet that they need to sterilize certain areas. Harriet retreats to her bed. Moments later, she notices a patch of something dark on the floor near Mrs. Langford's bed, a sticky, crimson blot. Harriet's pulse quickens when she realizes it looks like blood. The orderly quickly covers it with a mop, offering no explanation. That afternoon, Harriet tries to read a novel to distract herself, but she can't focus. Her eyes keep darting to Mrs. Langford, who sits eerily still. Finally, Harriet works up the courage to approach the nurse's station. "Do you know what's going on with my roommate?" she asks a tired-looking nurse behind the counter. The nurse hesitates, scanning Harriet's chart. "She shouldn't be in that room anymore," the nurse mumbles almost to herself. She passed away last night." Harriet's stomach drops. "What do you mean?" she stammers. "She's in there right now, whispering. She's alive." But the nurse's face pales. "That's impossible," she whispers. "Mrs. Langford passed on around 2 a.m. A doctor and 2 nurses confirmed it. She was transferred to the morgue." Fear grasps Harriet's throat, making it difficult to breathe. Without another word, she rushes back to her room. The bed next to hers is empty, sheets stripped. A faint odor of disinfectant still lingers, and there's a faint outline on the mattress where someone had been lying. Harriet's heart pummels her ribs. She turns, half expecting to see Mrs. Langford behind her. But there's no one. Days later, Harriet recovers enough to go home. On her final night in that room, she is too terrified to sleep. Every time she closes her eyes, she hears the soft hiss of whispering. She imagines the silhouette of the old woman beckoning her in the dark. She forces her eyes open and sits up until dawn. As she waits for her discharge papers, Harriet wonders if she truly saw Mrs. Langford, or just an echo of a lost, wandering soul. As she is wheeled out of St. Germain's in a wheelchair, Harriet glances back over her shoulder. For a split second, she thinks she sees a frail figure by the window in the hallway, a shape with gray hair, lips moving in a hushed, ceaseless prayer. Harriet blinks, and the figure is gone. Yet the chill in her spine remains. It is a reminder that sometimes the boundaries between life and death grow thin within these sterile walls. And in that hospital room, Harriet can't shake the sense that she witnessed a soul who refused or was unable to depart. St. Christopher's Hospital has stood on the corner of Pine and Elm Streets for nearly a century. In its early days, it served as an asylum for the criminally insane. Rumor has it that a notorious serial killer known as Edgar the Scalpel Moore was briefly held there for psychiatric evaluation before his violent end. Over the decades, the hospital underwent renovations, expansions, and rebranding, leaving behind only whispers of its dark past. But some nights, especially in the older wings, staff members claim they can still hear the echo of footsteps dragging through the halls. Layla, a newly hired night shift security guard, has heard the stories. She always dismissed them as urban legends. She patrols the corridors with a flashlight, checking locked doors and making sure no unauthorized visitors roam the premises. St. Christopher's at night feels more like a maze of shadows than a place of healing. The fluorescent lights flicker, and the hush is broken only by the distant hum of machinery or the occasional moan of a patient in pain. One Tuesday night, near the end of her shift, Layla finds herself assigned to the old psychiatric wing, which has been partially renovated into storage rooms. Most staff avoid this corridor. Too many stories of cold spots, rattling doorknobs, and doors slamming shut on their own. Layla remains skeptical, but can't deny an uneasy feeling whenever she steps into that part of the building. As she walks through the echoing hallway, her flashlight beam illuminates a battered wooden door marked "Authorized personnel only." She tries the knob, finding it locked. She makes a note on her clipboard, ready to move on, when she hears what sounds like someone breathing on the other side. Layla presses her ear to the door. The breathing becomes a low rasp, like lungs straining for air. She swallows hard. Then, just as she's about to walk away, a sharp rap strikes the door from the inside. 1, 2, 3 times. She jumps back, heart pounding, but the hallway behind her is empty. Despite her instincts screaming to leave, Layla places her ear against the door again. Silence. No movement, no more knocks. She shines her flashlight around, searching for any sign of forced entry or a hidden vent that might explain the noise. Finding nothing, she notes the incident in her log and continues her patrol. But the rest of the night, she can't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the following weeks, the strange occurrences multiply. Nurses in the ICU claim to see a tall figure in dark clothing skulking by the windows, only to vanish when approached. A surgeon recounts hearing footsteps behind him as he walked through a restricted hallway, the footsteps matching his pace no matter how fast he went. Then there is the rumor of fresh scratch marks on the steel elevator doors, marks that look suspiciously like scalpel incisions. Layla, determined to uncover the truth, delves into the hospital's history. In old archives, she discovers records about Edgar Moore's time in the facility. He was obsessed with the idea of immortality. Before his execution, he allegedly swore he would never truly leave these halls. The accounts detail how he terrorized staff, sometimes escaping his restraints to prowl the corridors at night. A chilling photograph shows a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a deranged gleam in his eyes. One evening, Layla decides to search the old psychiatric wing in earnest. She secures a key from the head custodian, who warns her to be careful. Long-abandoned patient rooms line the corridor, and half the fluorescent lights have burned out. Her flashlight flickers across stained walls and peeling wallpaper. The air is musty, thick with the scent of mold. She calls out, "Is anyone there?" Her voice echoes back, distorted and eerie. At the far end of the hallway is a door she's never noticed before. The doorknob is cold to the touch, and her stomach flips with apprehension. She uses the custodian's key, and the door creaks open to reveal a small, windowless room. Inside, rows of metal shelves hold dusty boxes of patient files. A single gurney sits in the middle, straps hanging from its sides. Something about the gurney looks darkly familiar. Layla recalls seeing images of old restraints used decades ago. A creeping sense of dread settles over her. Suddenly, a noise behind her makes her spin around. The door slams shut, plunging her into near darkness. Her flashlight beam dances wildly on the walls as she scrambles to reopen the door, but the knob won't budge. She calls out for help, voice shaking. That's when she hears it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Panicked, she points her flashlight in the direction of the sound. A figure stands in the corner, tall, dressed in outdated hospital attire spattered with dark stains. His eyes are hollow, cheeks sunken. Layla's breath catches in her throat as she recognizes the face from the photograph. Edgar, the scalpel Moore. She tries to scream, but terror binds her voice. The figure raises a hand, and in it glints a rusty scalpel. Layla scrambles backward, heart hammering. The ghostly killer takes a step forward, his movement unnaturally smooth, like a puppet on invisible strings. Each footfall sends a jolt of paralyzing fear through her. She stammers, You're not real." The figure's lips curl into a grotesque grin. The scalpel glints under the beam of her flashlight as he lifts it slowly. Without thinking, Layla lunges for the door, rattling the knob with all her strength. Her shoulder slams against the wood, and it bursts open. She half falls into the corridor, scraping her knees on the linoleum. Pain flares, but adrenaline forces her to keep moving. She dares a glance behind her. The room is empty, as if no one was ever there. But the sense of malevolence lingers like a cloud. Layla doesn't remember running to the nearest nurse's station or fumbling through an explanation. Eventually, other security officers arrive, searching the old wing. They find no sign of anyone, no footprints, no forced locks. Most chalk it up to overwork or an overactive imagination. But Layla knows what she saw. The scratch marks on the door and the faint coppery smell in the room confirm it. She resigns the next day, unable to endure another night in those corridors. Staff gossip in hushed tones, pointing out that strange sightings continue, especially near the old psychiatric ward. Some nights, the security camera footage shows a flicker, a fleeting silhouette lurking in a hallway, holding something metallic. Though it's always dismissed as a glitch, rumors of Edgar the Scalpel Moore's ghost persist. And every so often, a frantic patient will insist they've seen a tall figure with a twisted grin, roaming the halls, scalpel in hand, eager for his next victim. At Mercy Hills Hospital, Nurse Evelyn Roberts is renowned for her gentle bedside manner and impeccable record. She's the nurse you want caring for you when you're at your weakest. Calm, patient, and always wearing an angelic smile. Families thank her profusely for her dedication, and doctors rely on her to watch over critical patients. Yet, behind her soft-spoken demeanor, something unsettling seems to lurk. The rumors start innocently enough. Patients notice Nurse Evelyn's presence right before someone on the ward dies. An older gentleman in room 306 sees her standing by Mrs. Albright's bed, just moments before Mrs. Albright flatlines from a cardiac arrest. A young intern mentions how Nurse Evelyn often closes the curtains around a patient's bed, whispering comforting words. Then within hours, that patient is gone. The staff calls it coincidence, but as the pattern continues, a darker suspicion grows. Jonathan White, a journalist recovering from a car accident, picks up on the rumors. While stuck in a hospital bed for weeks, he's grown bored of daytime TV and mindless chatter. Instead, he listens carefully to passing conversations. One night, he overhears two orderlies discussing the angel of death, referencing Nurse Evelyn. Intrigued, Jonathan asks the orderlies what they mean. They glance around nervously before explaining that a suspiciously high number of Evelyn's patients have passed away during her shifts. Over the next few days, Jonathan observes her from his bed in room 212. He notices that Nurse Evelyn moves gracefully from room to room. She greets patients with a soft, melodic voice. Yet there's a subtle tension in her eyes, as if she's fighting an internal battle. On more than one occasion, Jonathan wakes in the middle of the night to find her standing just outside his door, staring in at him with a strange intensity. Each time, she disappears the moment he blinks, like a phantom in the corridor. Bothered by these nighttime sightings, Jonathan decides to investigate. Despite his fractured leg, he pushes himself in a wheelchair down the hallway one evening, determined to see what Nurse Evelyn does when most of the staff has gone home. The corridor is dimly lit, and an eerie hush hangs in the air. As he turns a corner, he nearly collides with Evelyn herself. She appears startled but quickly composes herself. A polite smile stretches across her lips. "You should be in bed," she says softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch is cool, nearly ice cold. Jonathan forces a smile, pretending he just needed some fresh air. Evelyn nods in understanding, though her gaze lingers on him a beat too long. In that moment, Jonathan notices something in her eyes, an emptiness, as if the gentle nurse facade slips to reveal something far less benign. She turns and continues down the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the tiles. Determined, Jonathan follows at a distance. Evelyn stops outside room 219, where an elderly patient named Mr. Thompson is on life support. Jonathan watches as she closes the door behind her. Through a narrow window, he sees her silhouette leaning over Mr. Thompson, hands hovering near the IV line. Suddenly, the heart monitor inside the room flatlines. Alarmed, Jonathan wheels himself closer. He peeks through the window just as Evelyn glances up. Her eyes lock on his, and for a moment, a flicker of panic crosses her face. She presses the call button, summoning the medical team. When doctors and nurses rush in, they find Mr. Thompson unresponsive. They attempt resuscitation, but fail. Nurse Evelyn stands to the side, tears brimming in her eyes, lamenting that she did everything she could. The medical staff console her, blaming the old man's failing heart. Only Jonathan remains unconvinced. Haunted by what he witnessed, Jonathan searches for more evidence. He discovers that Nurse Evelyn was once investigated when 5 patients in her care died under peculiar circumstances at another hospital. The investigation never found conclusive proof of wrongdoing, and Nurse Evelyn moved on to Mercy Hills with a clean record. The deeper Jonathan digs, the more he realizes that her patient mortality rate is alarmingly high. He presents this information to the hospital's head physician, Dr. Miller, who dismisses it as a morbid coincidence. "Evelyn is an outstanding nurse," he says. "She just happens to work in critical care, where unfortunately we lose patients more often." Frustrated, Jonathan decides to confront Evelyn directly. Late one night, he positions himself in the hallway outside her usual rounds. The hospital corridor is silent, except for the distant hum of machines. After an hour, he sees her white uniform emerge from a patient's room. She's alone, her posture rigid. Summoning his courage, Jonathan wheels forward and blocks her path. "I know what you've been doing," he says, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and accusation. Her eyes narrow, and for the first time, her angelic smile vanishes completely. In a low voice, she replies, "You have no idea what you're talking about." There is a glint of something predatory in her gaze. Jonathan presses on. "I've seen you, I have records, your transfer, the deaths, the timing. Why, Evelyn? Why?" For a moment, she looks almost sad. Then her lips curl into a chilling smile. "Some people can't be saved, Jonathan," she whispers. "I help them find peace." A wave of revulsion washes over him. Before he can respond, Evelyn steps closer. She places a hand on the back of his wheelchair, her grip surprisingly strong. Jonathan's breath catches in his throat as he realizes how vulnerable he is in that moment. Suddenly, overhead lights flood the corridor as Dr. Miller and 2 other nurses appear around the corner. Evelyn instantly regains her innocent demeanor, stepping away from Jonathan. They ask if everything is all right. Jonathan tries to speak up, to accuse her, but the words tangle in his mouth. Evelyn's calm expression warns him that no one will believe a half-recovered patient's wild claims. Soon after, Jonathan's doctor arranges for his discharge. Perhaps he's made too much noise, or perhaps Dr. Miller believes it's best if Jonathan recovers elsewhere. As he's leaving, Jonathan catches one last glimpse of Nurse Evelyn in the lobby. She stands by the nurse's station, hands clasped, that serene smile plastered on her face. Yet, her eyes track him with a silent promise, a promise that if he speaks out, she will find him again. A week later, Jonathan publishes an article online, recounting his suspicions and the eerie details of Nurse Evelyn's patients. The piece goes viral, sparking fear and outrage. The hospital denies any wrongdoing, and an internal investigation is launched. But by the time authorities come to question her, Nurse Evelyn has already resigned. No one knows where she's gone. Some claim to see her in other hospitals, a nurse in white quietly comforting dying patients. Others believe she vanished to avoid prosecution. Still, in the hushed corridors of Mercy Hills, stories linger of an angel of death, robed in white, who ends the suffering of her patients with a lethal mercy that only she understands. And for those who suspect her true nature, a single glance into her cold, unwavering eyes is enough to confirm that evil can wear the most benevolent of smiles, even within the hallowed walls meant to protect and heal.